last Sunday if I would speak this afternoon, Rebecca immediately said, "Oh, we're going to hear Jonah chapter 4 again, aren't we? The most forgotten book or chapter of the Bible." And I told her, no, we're going to talk about a forgotten man. You know, if we talk about wisdom, the first person that comes to our mind is Solomon. There's some other wise people that we think of, but Solomon's always at the top. If we talk about faith, we immediately go to Abraham. But what if we talk about a man that's wise and faithful? We don't think of anybody a lot of times. And I propose that Mordecai fits that description very well from what we read of him in the book of Esther. So that's who we're going to talk about this afternoon for a few minutes. There's several aspects of his life that I think points to this fact that he's a wise man full of faith. So we're going to break his life down into various parts. We're going to talk about him as a man. We're going to talk about him as a parent. We're going to talk about him as a citizen. And we're going to see how his wisdom and his faith come through in all these aspects of his life. So let's start by talking about him as a man. In Hebrew, Mordecai means little man. But we've all read the book of Esther. We know this little man gets into all sorts of big scenes. So I'm not sure that little man necessarily really describes him well. Let's talk about his possible genealogy for just a moment as a man. From what Ralph just read for us, we know he's the son of Jair, the son of Shimi, the son of Kish, the Benjamite. And the New King James Version, it says Kish was carried away into Babylonian captivity. Most of the translations leave out that word Kish and just say was carried away into Babylonian captivity, so it's not real clear which it is. As a matter of fact, if you speak to modern Jewish scholars, they're going to tell you that Kish was the father of King Saul. And that Kish had a son named Gera, Gera, who had a son named Shimi, who cursed David. We read about that in 2 Samuel chapter 16, verses 5 through 8. So we can tie these two names to what at the time of Mordecai would be old history. And that leads the Jews to say that Mordecai had to clean up a mess left by one of his ancestors. Oh, wait a minute, how do we get the mess? Well, when we read about Haman, who is Mordecai's enemy in the book of Esther, he's called an Agagite. A-G-A-G-I-T-E, Agagite. Where do we read about the name of Agag? Agag was the king of the Amalekites, and Saul was supposed to utterly destroy the Amalekites, but he didn't. So the Jews believe that Mordecai, a descendant of Kish, had to clean up the mess that was left by Saul when he did not do what God told him to do. And that's what led to the problems in the book of Esther. Now, whether that's true or not, we can't say for sure. But it puts an interesting spin on the book of Esther, and I thought it was worth presenting. We want to talk about Mordecai more from his point of view rather than a historical point of view, though, today. So first off, Mordecai was not ashamed of his nationality. Now, we know he told Esther not to tell anyone she was a Jew when she went to the king's house. But Mordecai openly told people he was a Jew. In Esther chapter 3, verse 4, it's said that as he sat at the gate, he told them he was a Jew. In Esther chapter 6, verse 10, the king refers to Mordecai as a Jew. So it was well known that he was a Jew. The book of Esther is interesting from a biblical point of view that the name of God does not appear in it. But it's very obvious as we look at Mordecai that we can see he believed in God, and he believed in following God. The first case we can show to prove that is in Esther chapter 3, verse 5, when Mordecai refuses to bow down to Haman. There was a law that as Haman walked by, you were to bow to him, and Mordecai alone refused to do so. In Esther chapter 4, verse 14, when Mordecai is talking to Esther, or relaying a message to Esther, he tells her that he knows the Jews will be saved, whether it's through her or not. He knows that God has a plan and that that plan will be carried out, and that means that the Jews must survive. He knows of the promise that God made to Abraham, and he knows that has to come through the lineage of the Jews. We also know from Esther chapter 4, verses 15 through 17, that he believes that prayer makes a difference. And if you're going to pray, you're going to be praying to a supreme being. So he believes in God. Mordecai as a man was hated. Do we ever feel hated in life? Have you ever had anybody in your life that you thought really just despised you? Most of us at some point in time have. Maybe not to the degree of Mordecai. Haman hates Mordecai. He hates him to the point that he wants to kill him. Haman builds a gallows 75 feet high for the destruction of Mordecai. Now, you know, when we think of a gallows, we think of somewhere with a rope where you hang a person by the neck. That's not what's being referred to here. This is most likely a spike in which you impale someone. And he wants him 75 feet high so everyone can see him hanging up there dead. That's hate. So as a man, we can see that Mordecai has faith, that God can get him through everything. Mordecai is never afraid of this gallows. And even if he is, he does not let it affect his life negatively. He stays focused on God's plan, the survival of the Jews. Now, what about Mordecai the parent? Esther's not his real daughter. He adopted Esther, took her in to raise his daughter when her parents died. But we're not talking about just taking in a family member to take care of them. He took her in like she was his daughter. He supported her. He advised her. He continues in that role even when she goes to the king's house. In Esther chapter 2, just a few verses after what Ralph read for us, starting in verse 11, we know that when she was in the house of the women of the king, Mordecai went by daily just to check on her. He couldn't see her, but he knew some of the people that took care of her. He found out how she was doing. That's the love of a parent. We have to believe that Mordecai had taught Esther about God. That she knew the ways of the Jewish people. Because when he came to her about the destruction of the Jewish nation by Haman, she told him that he and the Jews were to fast. Now, the word fast here, as I understand it, is not eating with a purpose, and the purpose was to pray. So she knows that's how they're to speak to God. Not only did she tell him to do that, she said that she and her maidens would do the same. So everyone that's with her is going to be fasting and praying. Parents, doesn't it take faith to teach your children? Doesn't it take wisdom to be able to impart this knowledge to your children so that even when they're in the house of the king, they remember it? And Mordecai had done this. He had taught Esther that God was important, that God should be obeyed, and that God could get them through. And that my life doesn't matter as long as God's plan happens. How about Mordecai the citizen? So when we're first introduced to him, we know that he's one of the men that sits at the king's gate. So what's it mean to sit at the king's gate? The people that sat at the king's gate gave advice to the people that were coming to see the king. They also gave advice to the king at times. So if you're going before the president or before a king or before a judge, who do you want to give advice to you? The village idiot or a man of wisdom? If you're the king or the president or the judge or whatever, who do you want sitting outside your door giving advice to the people that are coming to you? You want a man of wisdom. You want someone that can tell them the things to do so that business can be transacted quickly. And that's what Mordecai was. He was one of the men that gave advice to the people going to see the king. Mordecai was a man of integrity. He wasn't going to let anything happen to the king. Now, the king was not a godly man, but he was Mordecai's earthly ruler. God had put him there. If God had put him there, that must have been part of God's plan. And Mordecai wasn't going to let anything happen to him. As a matter of fact, when two of the other men that sat at the gate started plotting against the king, Mordecai let him know. At risk of his own life, he showed his faith in God's plan. Mordecai was known of the people around Esther. They knew who he was. They knew he was of some importance. He was an example to them. And when he heard of the rule of destruction for all the Jews, and he dressed himself in sackcloth, sat in ashes, they told Esther. Because they knew that was significant. If this man of wisdom and this man of faith is doing this mourning, there must be a reason. Mordecai was famous. In Esther chapter 6, verses 1 and 2, we see that the king remembered Mordecai saving his life, and he wanted to honor him. Mordecai, the story of Mordecai was written in the Chronicles of the King. He was recorded in the king's diary. When the king couldn't sleep, that was read back to him. And he summons Haman. What should I do to honor someone I want to honor? Oh, where would your mind go if the king called you in and I want to honor right there, same place Haman's went. The king wants to do something for me. And Haman, the man that hates Mordecai, gets to lead the king's horse through the city with Mordecai sitting on its back, dressed in the king's clothes. God's just burning a hole in Haman's heart. But it's because Mordecai was a man of wisdom and a man of faith that he was honored. In verse 11 of chapter 6, we read that story of him riding through, being led by the highest prince in the empire. Because of his faith, Mordecai plays a role in the salvation of the Jewish people. He knew that God had a plan, and he became a part of that plan. Oh, he's not in the lineage of Christ, but he played an important part in getting Christ here. As Mordecai was honored, Haman was lowered. His hate became deeper. That became his downfall. And Mordecai became his replacement. Mordecai became second in the kingdom, essentially. He's given a high office and the seal ring of the king. And he's allowed to write a law that will allow the Jews to defend themselves on what was to be the day of their death. The laws of the Persian Empire, when they were sealed by the king, were immutable. They could not be changed. They could not be taken away. It was going to happen that the people were going to rise against the Jews. But because of Mordecai's faith in God's plan and his wisdom in talking to the king, he was able to write a law allowing them to defend themselves and the Jewish nation to continue. So we can see these traits of wisdom and faith in Mordecai's life. As he sat at the king's gate, he was there with the wise men of the nation. Mordecai got understanding with his wisdom. He didn't pray to God for wisdom like Solomon did, or ask God to give him wisdom. But he obviously had that gift. As we said, he became second only to the king. We read that in the 10th chapter, the 3rd verse. He had faith that God would use the king in his plan, and that Mordecai saved his life so that the king would be there. He had faith that Esther might have been put in that place at that time for that reason. He had the wisdom to have taught Esther so that when that time arose, she had no fear of going before the king, knowing that he could command her immediate execution. But even at that, Mordecai knew if Esther didn't do what she needed to do, that God had a way to make it happen. He had faith that God would keep that promise made hundreds of years before to Abraham. I think from this we can see that Mordecai was a great man. He was a man of great wisdom. He was trusted by those around him because of his wisdom. And through his wisdom, he trusted God. He was trusted by the king because what he said made sense. He was also a man of great faith. He knew that the Jews would be saved in some way. He believed that it could be through Esther that this would happen. But even if not through her, God would save his people. There's no prophecy of Christ mentioned anywhere in the book of Esther. But we can see the thread running through it. Because if it weren't for the need for Christ, there would have been no need for the salvation of the Jews. We know that it was through the Jews, the tribe of Judah, that promise would be kept that was made to Abraham. Have you ever noted, as we read through the Bible, that men of God rise to the top? And that God uses them in his plans? Abraham, a man of great faith, was promised that the world would be blessed through him. The world would be blessed through him. That's us today. Joseph, a man of great integrity, rose to be second only to Pharaoh in Egypt. Moses, a boy taken from the river in a basket, grows up and leads his people out of Egypt and makes them into a nation. Joshua, likely a young man when Moses led Israel out of Egypt, became a great leader and led Israel into the promised land, the land that God had promised Abraham. David, a shepherd boy, became one of the greatest warrior kings of Israel. Solomon, the wise man, under whom Israel reached its peak. Let's add Mordecai to that list. The man who through his wisdom and through his faith provided a route for God's plan to continue. Do we have opportunities in our life like these men have? I say we do. Every day we have opportunities. But do we have the faith and the wisdom to take on those opportunities? Oh, we're probably not going to save a nation. But can we save a soul? Which is more valuable? A soul is much more valuable than a nation. My question is, are we exercising our faith and exercising our wisdom? Are we, like Mordecai, focused on God's plan, making it happen? Or are we more like Haman, getting what we can out of life? We need to take advantage of those opportunities God gives us. If you're not a Christian, now's the time to become one. Everything's ready. We're not promised another hour on this earth. If you are a Christian, but you're not living the way you should, now's the time to make it right with God. Maybe it's private. Maybe you and God need to deal with it. Or maybe there's something public that you need to bring before the congregation. We're here if you need to do that at this time. Come as we stand and sing.